Good afternoon. I'm Mabel Berezin. I'm professor of sociology at Cornell. I'm also director of the Institute for European Studies, which for those of you who are unfamiliar with our institute is part of the Mario Ainelli Center for International Studies. I want to welcome you to our Spring 2022 speaker series, which begins with 3 talks that focus on challenges to democracy, authoritarianism, and extremism in Europe and beyond. Today's talk is the 3rd in that series, and for those of you who have been attending the series, you have already heard me say that 2022 begins our 30th anniversary year here at IES. In spring 1992, the Berlin Wall had fallen, as had the old Soviet Union. Optimism was in the European political air, and in that exuberant moment, Cornell faculty who worked on Eastern and Western Europe, which had been treated as separate realms, came together to found the Institute for European Studies. The purpose was to analyze what everyone imagined would be a united and democratic Europe. The hope and the optimism of 1992 was more than dissipating when we conceived this series for our 30th anniversary year, with the opening lectures focused upon contemporary challenges to democracy. Since our last talk at the beginning of February, the world has turned upside down. With Putin's invasion of Ukraine, in many ways, we are catapulted back to Europe 1938 when Hitler marched into the Sudetenland. At this tragic moment in Europe, we are fortunate to have with us Federico Finchelstein, who received his PhD in history at Cornell in 2006. And to celebrate our 30th year, we have been inviting prominent scholars who began their European academic journey at IES and Cornell. Federico Finchelstein was the recipient of one of our graduate fellowships, and he used that fellowship to do his research. He is currently professor of history at the New School for Social Research. Federico Finchelstein is one of the foremost historians of global fascism and populism writing today. His writings span the globe from Latin America to Europe. He is a prolific scholar and public intellectual in the United States, Europe, and Latin America. I can only give a flavor of his writings here. He has written on transatlantic fascism, from fascism to populism in history, the ideological origins of the dirty war, and most recently, Brief History of Fascist Lies. He also has a book that will be coming out on fascist mythologies. He regularly writes for the Washington Post, The Guardian, and numerous European publications. One of my favorites of his articles is a Washington Post piece that he did on Donald Trump, and the title of the article was "Donald Trump Has Blurred the Line Between Populism and Fascism in a Dangerous Way." This was a discussion of the January 6th events in Washington. I want to turn this over to Professor Finchelstein, and I do want to remind you that you will have a chance to engage with him in the question and answer period. So without listening anymore to me, I want us to listen to Professor Finchelstein, who will speak to us today about From Populism to Fascism. Okay.
Well, thank you so much. And you know, it's really an honor to be well, back in this case by Zoom, but back at Cornell, and thank you so much, Professor Berezin, for this very generous introduction. And I am, you know, I have learned so much from your own work on populism and fascism, and even remember that when I was a doctoral student at Cornell, we met, and you, I think you have arrived at Cornell from Stanford at the time. And I, you know, I really regard our intellectual exchanges as very important to my own interpretation of these things. So again, it is really a pleasure to be back. Although the topic at hand is not, I mean, it's not a happy topic, and it's not a fantastic topic, and yet it is an important topic that we need to understand, and in order perhaps to, well, certainly in order to fight it. And the topic at hand is, of course, the attacks against democracy. Attacks against democracy that have been shaped and reformulated in different forms, from fascism to populism to to a new wave of populists turning very, very close to fascism. Even as Professor Beresin was, you mentioned the title of that article, blurring the lines between what fascism and populism were. These were authoritarian and anti-democratic ideologies in many ways, but they share similarities, but they also presented important historical distinctions. And yet those distinctions are being unmade by the likes of Donald Trump, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, Narendra Modi in India, Orban in Hungary, and many, many others throughout the world. So what I propose is to ask a kind of proverbial historical question in the context of the current attacks against democracy. And this question, of course, is the question that we historians ask again when considering the connections between, we ask this again and again when considering the connections between past and present. And this question is simple: what is new? What is new in what we are seeing? There are soundings of the past in current authoritarian attacks, and yet this happens in a very different context, and actually in a very different century. So what I would propose to do today is to analyze this, of course, in a very brief manner, because we only have some minutes, and I actually, as I was telling Professor Beresin, I enjoy much the Q&A and the discussion rather than, in my own case, listening to myself. And yet still I will present my arguments, and hopefully we can have a fruitful discussion of them. The first thing I think we should start with is that the current crisis of democracy is a manufactured one, insofar as it is presented and pushed by people that want democracy to fail. And of course, this is not new. In order to understand this, we have to go back to other democratic ideologies, such as fascism and classic populism. Before all that, I would like just to briefly talk about how not to think about these issues. And I'm thinking about this really seminal essay by a major historian of fascism, which was Seb Sternhell. And he wrote this important article saying how not to think about fascism. And I would like to reformulate the question in terms of how not to think about the current situation. And how not to think about the current situation is a question that I think presents an easy answer, and yet it is that easy answer is not necessarily enforced or shared by many people that are participating on debates. Of course, how not to think about this? We cannot think about these issues in terms of our nation first, or in terms of ethnocentrism, in terms of even Eurocentrism or Americanocentrism. What happens in America relates to Europe, to Latin America, many other parts of the world. And the question for us is to analyze what are the connections. What makes, if there are some distinctions, what makes the case of, for example, being specific to American Trumpism vis-a-vis other forms of what I call wannabe fascism. So in that sense, it is important not to, to study our sources, including Donald Trump, but not necessarily to accept, very deep ideological premises which are rooted in xenophobia and in a sort of American Sonderbe view, as American special uniqueness views. In that sense, certainly we cannot agree. I think we shouldn't agree with this idea that presented by Donald Trump himself, when he said that if he had to define our current era, he will define it as, I quote, the age of Trump. Are we living an age of Trump, or is just Trump a paradigmatic case, an almost symptomatic case of a larger global trend? And certainly I will agree with the last statement and not with what Trump said. And yet we have seen new works on this issue, new experts or new new specialists of of the last hour that tend to agree with those statements indicating that that what we are seeing is totally new and there is no history behind it. And this is certainly highly problematic. And yet I see the marketing dimension of these new works in the sense that they present themselves as, and they agree with Trump, they present themselves as totally new analysis of something that is totally and absolutely new. And the price to be paid for that is that they ignore decades of bibliography, of historiography, of works in politics and political science, sociology, anthropology, and many other fields. So this is really a problem. This is not how to think in terms of what's going on. And I propose something very different that is, of course, shared by many colleagues in the field, which is that in order to think about what is new, we also need to think about what is not new and connect the present with history. So this historical view also emphasizes the need to think what is considered the center and what is considered the margins. In my own case, I have analyzed what was or is often considered the margins of Europe and also Latin America, and many times for one particular reason, studying countries like Italy or Argentina or Brazil is important to consider basically what's going on. Why? Because in these countries, what you have is, for example, in Italy with fascism or in Argentina or Brazil with populism, is that you have regimes in the sense that you can then see not only what these people say, but also what they do. So thinking in terms of populism and fascism in power is also a key dimension that I think we should analyze. And last, before I enter into what is actually my main argument today, I would like to mention a so-called fascism debate in which, which is a very strange debate about the fascism of current phenomena, and especially with regards to Donald Trump. And in this debate, what you have is mostly people working on fascism that said that one way or the other they saw a lot of connections. And on the other hand, you saw people that actually are not experts on fascism, are not experts on populism, and yet they claim that Trump was not like Hitler, Trump was not like Mussolini, as if that entails a real work of transnational history or even comparative history. Of course, if the question is Trump like Hitler, the answer is clear. He's not. No one is like Hitler. Mussolini was not like Hitler. But the question, of course, is not. It has to be more complicated than that, and it cannot be reduced to one tweet. So just to return to my argument, I will briefly recap what I said. I mean, the question is what is new, how we can answer. The question of what is new requires answering, of course, what is not new, and yet sometimes it is the case that these global leaders of fighting democracy, people such as Donald Trump in the US, Bolsonaro in Brazil, or Narendra Modi in India, they claim that they are so new and so different that no history is required for understanding them. Including this famous statement by Mr. Trump, who, with the typical immodesty that is so typical of him, defined these new times as obviously totally new for him, and he called them the age of Trump. Now, I certainly disagree with that idea, implying that what we are living is totally different, and yet newcomers to the field studying these issues, they seem to agree with that, and they present these phenomena as having no history. Of course, there are like, I think, I guess, marketing reasons for that, in the sense that if Trump is right and these interpreters are right, then these new works are, present a very new perspective. But of course, that comes at the price of ignoring decades of bibliography on these issues. So many historians, sociologists, political scientists, anthropologists working on fascism and populism. And our task, of course, is to remind everybody, I think, that we need to keep doing the difficult work, which is reading the bibliography, reading from the past, and see what's new in the present and what is not. in that sense, I would like to reframe a very limited debate that happened in the US, the so-called fascism debate, which was a very strange one, because on the one hand, you have mostly experts on fascism saying there are many connections here. And on the other side, people that are actually non-experts, that don't know much about fascism, stating in a very assertive manner that with 100% confidence that this is not fascism because Trump is not like Hitler. And of course, Trump doesn't have a Hitler's mustache and doesn't look like Hitler, but that's not the point. Like in Histories of Fascism and Populism, we emphasize issues of continuity, not analogy, and certainly not equation or full identification. So the point is that, beyond these kind of limited debates, I think we need to do the difficult thing, which is to study the history and see the connections. What is new, what is not. So that's where we stop, and I will return to the main argument now, which is that beyond Eurocentric perspectives, beyond Americanocentric or other ethnocentric perspective, we need to integrate global histories of authoritarianism in the past, from fascism to populism, in order to understand what's going on. Now, what's going on, and in that sense, now I would like to do a kind of, in passing, a kind of three-type chronology of actors in this context, is that in terms of I would say the recent history of anti-democracy, and by that I mean, I guess, the last 120 years, we have had at least three waves. The first wave was in the 20th century, basically fascism. That against democracy, you have these movements throughout the world that wanted to destroy it in order to create mass dictatorships, which were rooted in key elements that will be later shared by populists. And these elements were a messianic notion of leadership, which involved a cult. It involved issues of, imperialism. It involved, of course, issues that I will return to in a second, such as important issues, actually, militarization, violence, racism, and certainly dictatorship. So I cannot obviously define fascism in a second. For that, there is a short answer and a long answer. In terms of my answers to these questions, in terms of the long answer, I have written, this is my many books on fascism. This is one in which from fascism to populism, in which I try to enumerate different agreements by the historiography, by historians and other experts, in order to know what is fascism. And what is fascism in history is the title of my chapter 1. I cannot reproduce the chapter here, but I will try to be more succinct today in order to explain you in 4 characteristics what fascism is mainly about. Because that will allow us, and by the way, this is the topic of my next book, which in a way, having written books on the trajectory from fascism to populism, what I'm trying to understand now is whether we are turning again from populism to fascism. And so in a way, this book will be the number 3 of my trilogy on fascism and populism. And in that sense, the question is, now if we ask a question like this, are we going back to fascism? The answer is not simple. I'm sorry for this, because sometimes, public debate sometimes sadly demand a simple answer, but I don't think as scholars we can give that. And of course that poses limits to our ability to be out there, because what is required often is simple answers, and I don't think we can responsibly give them like that. Because are we returning to fascism? So my answer is not simple, it's yes and no. Yes, in the sense that we are seeing things in current populism that look and actually replicate fascist patterns, and no, because this is not exactly as fascism was. So the issue of history provides, of course, big continuities, but also important breaks. Now, to be more explicit about the different actors, I would say today that we should consider 3 waves. So the first, I was talking about it a little bit before, is the fascists. The fascists came about after the First World War, and they came about as rooted in legacies, which were by the time centuries old, of the Enlightenment, and even more specifically, and Hannah Arendt reminded us, in histories of imperialism and racism. So there is a lot of precedent to fascism, and yet fascism becomes a new form of politics after the First World War. The first countries in which it came to power were first Italy, of course, then Germany, Spain, and a couple of other countries, which also then brings us to the issue of fascism in power, which is not the general rule. Fascism existed throughout the world, from India to Brazil to Argentina to China, but only in a few countries fascism became a regime. For example, Seb Sternhell, the great historian of fascism, reminded us that fascism could be three different things: an ideology, a movement, and a regime. And only a few times these three things were together. And here it is important to mention the work of another historian, Robert Paxton, who basically explains this as different cycles of fascism. And it's not generally the case that we have the three together. Then after 45, those fascism in power were defeated. And what happened is not, of course, that fascism disappeared, but rather than the people that decided to remain fascist were not, since then, actually winners in the new political systems. They never returned to power as fascists, I mean. So in one of the countries that were, when they were perhaps the most important, which is in Italy, they were, I mean, they couldn't like move beyond a certain electoral threshold. And in fact, they were excluded from power. And of course, this happened in many other countries. Now, what is interesting to me is not their, I mean, you know, it's not only their history, but how people that were like them decided to go in a different way, and they were successful. And these people were not the neo-fascists, people that decided to remain fascist, but rather fascists and dictators that decided after 1945 to re-enter the world of democracy. As you know, fascism, in its most famous cases, worked within democracy to destroy democracy. Though democracy was destroyed from within, and a dictatorship was established from above. So that's a typical trajectory, not the only one, but very much typical trajectory of fascism. Cases, of course, of Hitler and Mussolini, the most archetypical ones. Now, if we analyze the story of people that were dictators and fascists and decided to, in a way, change, then we need to move from Europe to Latin America, not because they were only in Latin America, but it was in Latin America where they first were successful, in the sense that these people were able to reach power. And here the story is very different. So we have people like General Juan Domingo Perón in Argentina, or Getulio Vargas in Brazil, and many others in Venezuela, in Bolivia, and other places throughout the 1940s and early 1950s, Ecuador, that basically they did the opposite of what the fascists did. They destroyed, in a way, I mean, in the case of Perón, he was a strongman in a dictatorship. And what did he do? The opposite of what Hitler did. So he decided to destroy the dictatorship from within in order to create a democracy from above, because he called for elections, and he was elected president in elections which were quite fair. By the time, you know, by a few years later, when the constitution was reformed and women were allowed to vote, in Perón's Argentina, democracy was, you know, in many ways more real than in the US, because in Argentina everybody could vote, and the vote mattered. Which, of course, as you know, that wasn't the case in the US, where depending on the color of your skin, perhaps your vote didn't matter. But then, of course, this democracy was very specific and particular. It was an illiberal democracy. Here, the work of Professor Berezin is important to think this category. And it was an authoritarian democracy, in the sense that, yes, these former fascists and dictators combined the legitimacy of the vote with other policies which reminded people, and rightly so, of the fascism that happened, and actually of the fascists they used to be, and the fascism that happened before them. So this combination of authoritarianism, actually of fascism and democracy, which I call a reformulation of fascism in a democratic key, actually created a new type of regime, which I call, among many others, and especially following on the work of Italian, Argentine sociologist Gino Germani, I approach as modern populism. So modern populism as a regime was born out of this reformulation of fascism and the dictatorship in a democratic key. So now let me focus now on four key dimensions, what I call 4 pillars of fascism. And these pillars are not only important to understand fascism, but also populism, because it was precisely, I mean, there were many continuities between fascism and populism, but populists, after 45, they left behind these 4 key dimensions of fascism. They continue others, but these 4 dimensions they left behind. And these 4 dimensions are, first, a key element of fascism, which is violence, the glorification of violence and the militarization of politics. Politics considered as a total war, violence considered as a source of power, and as opposed to a more Beberian approach by liberal conservatives and again populists, fascists actually consider that it was not only important to have the monopoly of violence, but actually to exercise it. So for fascists, violence needed to be exercised. Violence, and as Hitler said, terror, were essential dimensions of politics. And this dimension of violence and the glorification of violence and the militarization of politics was left behind by populists. In these populist regimes, you don't have high levels of violence. Certainly, you have actually explicit takes and critiques on the idea that violence is more important than consensus, or it can be the only source of consensus, that terror is the only source of convincing people, as Hitler said, or as Mussolini said. So people like Perón, Vargas, and others will disagree with this. So they will leave this key dimension of fascism behind. So number 1, violence, key to fascism, left behind by populists. The second dimension is lies and propaganda. And in this sense, populists lie, not like fascists, but like other politicians. As Hannah Arendt said, it's, lies and politics are intimately linked. They were friends and they were together since, ancient times. And yet, when fascism appears, it presents an idea of lies and a connection between lies and mythology that really put them far away and in far distance to other political approaches. Because yes, all politicians lie, but only fascists not only believe in those lies, but want to change the world according to these lies. And now let me give you a gruesome example of this dimension, which is a major fascist anti-Semitic lie, the lie that Jews are in their nature, dirty and spread disease. So this is a major anti-Semitic lie, an infamous lie. And yet, what did the Nazis do with this lie? So they put Jews, European Jews, in ghettos and concentration camps with horrible sanitary conditions and healthy conditions that they created. And in this context, yes, Jewish inmates became dirty and started spreading disease. And then in the Nazi mind, this would be somehow a proof that the lie was true. But in fact, it is this kind of perverse mechanism where not only lies are believed, but also they are imposed onto the world. So the world is turned upside down, and now reality is not only denied, but is changed in order for reality to be or to conform to the lie. This denial of the empirical nature of observation is typical of fascism, and populists did not want anything to do with that. And if you want to, or if you are interested in this, as I am, I recommend, this is the book I wrote on this topic, which is A History of Fascist Lies, which in the context of this talk is element number 2. So element number 1 of fascism, violence and the militarization of politics. Populism, not much of that. Element number 2, manufactured lies, Orwellian lies, if you will. Key to fascism, not that much so in terms of populism. Element number 3 is xenophobia, the politics of xenophobia, demonization, and racism. This is a sine qua non, a central element of fascism. There is no fascism without racism. Of course, you can have racism without fascism, but there is no fascism without xenophobia, no fascism without demonization of an extreme kind, and no fascism without this deep, extreme form of hatred, which of course it is connected to the previous point. So this radical form of racism and xenophobia and demonization leads not only to rhetorical excess, but also to the practice of imprisonment, concentration, imprisonment, deportation, and even eventually, in some cases, such as Spain, Italy, or Germany, the elimination of the other. These politics of hatred, these extreme politics of hatred, were also left behind by populists after 45. Yes, they demonize people. Yes, they bully people, both rhetorically and sometimes even practically. But these extreme dimensions of fascism were left behind, and actually very explicitly so by most populists. They will reflect on this and they will say, no, this is not what we are about. And finally, the last element, the last key element of fascism is dictatorship. So you cannot have fascism without dictatorship. Of course, you can have dictatorship without fascism. There are many dictatorships which are not fascist, but you cannot have fascism without dictatorship. This element, of course, was left behind by populists, who from, I will say now, Juan Domingo Perón or Getulio Vargas to Silvio Berlusconi and many other 20th century populists, when they lost, they didn't like it, but they respected the nature and the outcome of the vote. They didn't like it. They would present as a misguided vote, a vote against the people and the leader, and so on and so forth. But this idea that populism works within democracy, including the idea that they respected negative electoral outcomes. And of course, now we come to the third category. So I talk about fascists and populists, but now I would like to talk about this new wave of populists. I call them wannabe fascists or would-be fascists, who actually seem to be returning to these key dimensions of fascism. And if insofar as they are returning to these key dimensions, then we ask the question and we wonder, what kind of populism is this? It's a populism that is unmaking itself, that is returning to the, in a way, to many, I will say now, we will explore this in terms of the 4 pillars that I have just presented, the 4 foundations of fascism. They seem to be returning to 1, 2, or 3, or even 4 of those foundations. And to the extent that they return to them, then I think it will be easier to have an assessment and to say, okay, this is for me is fascism and it's no longer populism. There is no populism, of course, without democracy. And in terms of this, perhaps now I can reflect briefly, very briefly, on different wannabe fascists. People like Trump or Bolsonaro, for example, certainly check the 3 of the 4 pillars. So violence and the glorification of violence and the militarization of politics, certainly they understand politics in that way. Here, of course, we cannot, we will have to differentiate between, low levels, to some extent of violence vis-a-vis the violence of fascism. So I leave it to you in a way to make your own assessment about how fascist is this or not. But certainly we are close. This is my view. Regarding lies, I think this is perhaps the closest element. The level of lies in someone like Bolsonaro or Trump, and the use of lies, the manufacture of lies as mythologies and cult of the leader and so on, I think that is, within the fascist pattern and certainly not the populist one. Xenophobia, racism, and hatred for the other probably will be hard to understand the new wannabe fascist populists without these extreme forms of demonization. And finally, dictatorship. Until recently, I always thought, okay, they are still within populism because they are not reaching this kind of dictatorial element. And in the case of the US, then we need to wonder about January 6th and what was, in my view, a coup d'etat in the US, a failed coup d'etat. But the question then is like, I think, in that case, if we need to focus on Trump, I would say that in that case, then it was super close. because if he was to, had Trump succeeded in his coup d'etat, how should we call a president that is no longer supported by an electoral outcome and yet remains in power? So for me, the answer will be a dictator. And a dictator, actually, he would have been who also shared these three other elements: lies, violence, and xenophobia. So, I mean, I think, still that's failed. And I think still we should, I prefer to consider them within this kind of wave, radical and ultimate way of populism that wants to return to fascism. And this is not a finished story. So it's hard to say as an historian or as an expert on both fascism and populism what is going to happen. But I think this is worrisome enough. Without needing to solve with a simple question these debates, I think that this is worrisome enough, that we have a new wave of populists that are getting closer and closer as we speak to fascism. So perhaps I can finish there.
Well, thank you. That was a really stimulating talk. And, oh, okay, here we are. So let me just see how we're doing, if there are any, we don't have any open questions at the moment. I guess I could start a little bit. And, I think from our conversations I guess mainly we converse on social media these days, but I've always been, and I've written this, a little skeptical of the fascist today comparison. And I think that you did, and I think that my mind has changed considerably after January 6th. Although, as I was listening to you, and I was very much persuaded by what you just said, I was thinking of, this term fascism, and I was thinking of Nazism, and which is, a lot of historians agree is a different thing, although they often conflate the two. And I was in my mind, I was thinking fascism, Nazism, dictatorship. And I was wondering, is there any way to extricate the non-democracy, the admitted non-democracy? Say Trump had come back, okay? January 6th succeeded. It wouldn't be an election for sure. It would be close to. And is there any way to extricate historically the concept of dictatorship from the concept of fascism? Because I have it's really easy for me to say that was threat to democracy, non-democracy, everything, and still have a little trouble with the fascist part. So anything you want to say? I see we're getting questions. So if you could start with mine, but I'm going to check the question and answer thing too. All right.
Yes, I think you're making a key point, and in order to share the current book I'm writing, so each chapter will be on each of these sort of pillars or each foundation. So the chapter number 4 will be an approach to the history of dictatorship and the meaning of dictatorship. And as you know, dictatorship has been many things, and there were many kinds, both in terms of theories and practical matters. And again, like an older type of dictatorship, the Roman one was a constitutional one, in the sense that it was mandated, it was within the law. And so we are not talking about that. Like, we are talking about a new kind of dictatorship that is outside of the law, in the sense that there is no place in the law for this notion of permanent power. And of course, that doesn't make it fascist. There were other types of dictatorships, which were, either commissarial or sovereign. There are many categories here, but they were permanent. Now, the fascist one is a dictatorship that doesn't present itself as a bracket. It doesn't present itself as the outcome of an state of exception. Because, for example, when as soon as I was born, sooner than later, I became, a person living in a dictatorship. And that dictatorship was in between a kind of fascist kind and a more traditional one, because they play with the idea of being permanent, but they also said, we are here in order to put things in order, and then eventually the constitutional order will return. So in traditional dictatorships, you have these claims of legitimacy, claims of legality, which of course are not legal, but there is an attempt to legalize the situation. Whereas in fascism, they just don't care. They just don't care. And then, again, this is a kind of hypothetical question, because will someone like Barr would have tried to justify legally what Trump was doing? certainly Trump probably had more of a fascist approach in the sense that he didn't care. I mean, and I was reading about, like, I'm writing this chapter, so, you know, a Spanish conservative, for example, Ortega y Gasset, reflected on this issue at the time of fascism and said, the difference between the fascists and others is they just don't care about whether they are legal or not. Of course, they had people like Carl Schmitt and others, or Rocco, or I mean, people trying to make it legal. So I don't have an answer, I mean, for that. I mean, what kind of dictatorship they would have been. But in any case, what is troubling, and again, like, I agree with you that there is a problem of falling a kind of into the yes or no debate. Because at the end of the day, I mean, the issue of dictatorship, I mean, what kind of dictatorship, a totalitarian, a Caesaristic? The question is that we were very close to that. And of course, it begs the question of what kind, and it's difficult to know given that it didn't happen. But go ahead, sorry.
No, I'm flooded with questions now.
Go ahead.
So
sorry that I didn't answer. Yeah.
Get some of our guests. Lots of questions coming in. So let me ask. I'm getting them. So let me try to. All right, I have 5 here. So I want the one I was expecting came right off the bat here. I'll give them to you, and I want you to know there are a lot of them. So it's to the extent that you could do a quick answer on any of these complicated questions. But anyway. All right, where does Putin fall on the fascism spectrum?
We collect them, or I answer?
I think maybe we can. The first 2 aren't really very related because we have Putin, and then we have, I can't quite pronounce his name, but Bukele's co-optation of the Supreme Court in El Salvador. So there.
Oh, I see. Okay.
It's a different kind of question, and I'd like to sort of. So. I would, I think if you can answer the Putin, and I'm going to try to put them together now, but I think those, you could start with Putin because Putin's on everyone's mind, I think, at the moment. So.
Yes, I mean, I mean, this is not, I don't think it is I have an easy answer for this. I'm struggling with the question myself. I think about this every day. I start reading the paper in the morning. To me, you know, first, I mean, let's start with the itineraries that I'm talking about, from fascism to populism and from populism to wannabe fascism. And certainly Putin doesn't come from there. I don't think Putin is a populist. Like, he's not an elected leader. I mean, let's say an elected leader with free elections. So, you know, I mean, the rule of Putin is not a populist one insofar as there is, and there was no democracy in Russia during the elections that he won. So I don't think we are, I mean, certainly he doesn't fall into the category of the wannabe fascists that I'm analyzing, people that are destroying democracy from within, such as Trump, Bolsonaro, Modi, and of course, Bukele. I will return to that question. So the question is, like, the trajectory might be different. So Putin at this point is coming from a dictatorial tradition, which is not fascist. And the question that we are asking now is what kind of dictator he is turning into. So this is the question. I will frame the question of whether he's a fascist or not in a very different framework to the one that we are using for analyzing this populist turning into or returning or getting closer and closer to fascism, because Putin is not a populist. He's an autocrat that is reformulating his dictatorial rule in the ways of, you know, externalizing this logic, all or nothing logic, into an actual war of, you know, quite a horrible one. Now, so the point is that then, if I want to use my own framework in terms of these 4 foundations of pillars, I will say that you have I mean, like, certainly a development of the issue of violence. I mean, you have the dictatorship, although as Professor Beresin asked me, dictatorship doesn't necessarily mean fascist, but you have that element. To me, it's unclear to what extent the element of xenophobia and racism is central to his politics, as for example, as this is central for Trump, or it was central for to Hitler. And then, of course, you have the dimension of lies, which is acquiring more and more like an Orwellian dimension as well. And yet, as Hannah Arendt reminded us, there is a Soviet tradition to that. So my point is, like, rather than populist fascism, the question for him is totalitarianism and Soviet rule and perhaps fascism. So the comparison is different. I think this is another picture I think that we need to be asking. And perhaps I'm not the right expert for that because I am the
You have
fascist.
another question on Putin and the Ukraine. I'm going to group that. I have two so far, and that's I'm going to follow. This is a little bit longer. It's hard not to think about the current situation in the Ukraine with your topic. Oh, yes. From your historical perspective, how common is it to see people who share the elements of fascism you have enumerated, say Vladimir Putin, which I think you've just told us maybe not, but accusing their opponents of being fascists? That is what Putin did. So although there are individuals and groups in the Ukraine who have embraced the anti-Semitic nationalist Bandera legacy, it is surreal for Putin to claim to denazify a country led by a Jewish president of Ukraine who lost relatives in the Shoah. Could you offer some reflections on that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with a lot of points being made in the question that is far-fetched. And it's, I mean, I don't think we should equate anti-fascism with democracy, because in fact, the Soviet Union fought an anti-fascist war and it was a dictatorship. But this is not the case for Putin. He's not fighting an anti-fascist war, and yet he's claiming that that is the case, and the claim is totally fake. So it's a piece of mythology and propaganda trying to go back again. That's why I was saying we should also reconsider the Soviet totalitarian dimension, because he's lying and presenting this war as if it was the outcome or a continuity with Soviet history, with the great war of liberation of that Stalin provided. So going back to Putin fascism, I wonder whether the question also is, or should we put in Stalin? Now, so it's, I think that is also, I mean, perhaps that could be, if we want to, lying in an Orwellian sense doesn't make a fascist a fascist. Like, I mean, I was trying to present this combination of elements which present the whole picture, but certainly if we focus or laser focus on that aspect, that perhaps is the most fascist dimension that we can find, both in Putin and the war. Now, that is not unique. And of course, Trump and many others define their enemies as fascists. I mean, of course, by invoking another lie, which is that fascism can be on the left. And that's a typical, new kind of fascist lie, because fascism was the most right-wing ideology that ever existed. So to claim the opposite, exactly opposite, is part of the mythology.
Hey, we have three questions I'd like to get out here because I want to make sure that you consider them all. The first one is very specific, and so I'm going to give the three of them. But anyway, the first one is, oops, did I lose it? Okay. Would you discuss racism in fascist Italy in further detail? How successful were the racial laws? So that's the first question. The second question is a little bit more general, and it has to do with the Supreme Court in El Salvador. That Berkeley's co-optation of the Supreme Court in El Salvador to allow him to run for re-election as following the elements of dictatorship, or is it differentiated by remaining an attempt at changing the rules within democratic institutions? So it's rule changing democratic institutions. And then let me see, there's another one that's a similar vein. Do you maintain what you wrote many years ago, that populism remains in the democratic realm? So those are the three questions: Italy, El Salvador, and your commitment to the idea that populism remains in the democratic realm. So.
Yes, I mean, these are fantastic questions. I mean, the Salvador, I mean, and Bukele, I think I see Bukele as a wannabe fascist, as just another example of this trend that is, paradigmatically represented by the likes of Trump and Bolsonaro. So Bukele belongs to that. He's a populist that is actually destroying, the last remnants of democracy in El Salvador. And thereby, I mean, this connects us to not to the Italy question, but to the last question, I think, which is, I mean, that I still see, of course, populism as being rooted in the, as rooting its legitimacy in the popular sovereignty of free elections. I mean, that is what gives legitimacy to the populist approach to politics. I mean, winning elections. And yet you wonder a couple of things. What kind of populism is that refuses or really plays down key elements of the democracy to the extent that it's destroying it? And as I say, you know, in my book on fascism and populism, populism ceases to be populist when there is no democracy. And this is the question, I mean, and it can come from, you know, from the left or the right. I mean, you know, the person, I thank the person that asked that question because obviously that question is coming from my book. So in that book, I mean, thank you for reading it. In that book, I explain how eventually what you have is in Venezuela, for example, you have Chavez is a form of populism, but eventually when this turns, you know, to the destruction of democracy in Venezuela, what you have in Maduro is a dictator. He's no longer a populist. And yet he's not a wannabe fascist because he lacks some of the elements that I was describing before. Bukele, on the other hand, is closer to that situation. You cannot have fascism on the left. So you are talking about different types of dictatorial rule, if you will. So my answer to that question is historical. Like, are we, and this is a, you know, I think we are witnessing now populism turning against itself in the sense of turning against a basic promise of populism, which is democracy. An authoritarian one, and yet one, you know, an approach to politics that roots its legitimacy in free elections and not permanent power. Regarding Italy and racism, here I can only recommend the recent work of the Italian historian Simone Levi-Sulam. I mean, the effects of the, you know, there is this kind of a stereotype that people like, that historians like Sulam, like Levi-Sulam are, you know, hopefully, how can I say, making it clear that this was just a stereotype. That is the idea that racism in Italy was not as terrible because it was not Nazi. And in fact, like, he demonstrates how the Holocaust happened in Italy, not only because of the Nazis, but also because of the collaboration of Italian fascists and the success of those racist policies. And then when you move the question from, that's why I talk about, you might recall that one of these pillars is not anti-Semitism, but racism and xenophobia. So once, anti-Semitism is a form of racism and xenophobia. So when you move, you know, a little bit, you know, behind anti-Semitism, and you think in terms of xenophobia and racism, then you understand the racial laws in a kind of continuum of extreme racist policies by Italian fascists in North Africa, in Ethiopia, and in other places. So I think the question is connected to previous histories of racism and xenophobia.
We have another question here. Let me see. What experience, this is, I'm going to read it directly because I can't quite deconstruct it. What experience or information appears to accelerate people who have been populists to become fascist supporters, or how do they become disaffected? I think that's what the question means. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that is also a really complex question demanding a very complex answer, which I cannot give in 30 seconds, but I will try. I mean, one key element here, of course, is the cult of the leader. I mean, populism emphasizes this messianic notion of the leader, I mean, but plays with it without, in a way, leaving the democratic element behind. Because if we think about populism, and this is something that I talk about in my book, From Fascism to Populism, is that it has this kind of dual notion of legitimacy, dual notion of what makes the leader important and almost key to politics, an essential dimension of politics. One, of course, is the democratic one. The leader has won. The leader was voted. But then again, there is a kind of different, I mean, so in a way that is the democratic one because the leader is representing the vote of the people. And yet populism brings back a notion which was previously fascist and not necessarily democratic, which is beyond the vote. A fascist leader represents the people. So the fascist leader is the personification of the people and the nation. And populists are dual about it. They say the leader represents and is the personification, the embodiment of the people and the nation, but also the leader is legitimate because of the vote. Whereas if you ask a fascist about that, they will say the vote is not necessary because Mussolini is the eternal leader of the Italian people. So the connection there is the cult of the leader. And to the extent that the cult of the leader becomes so so fanatic? And this is only one element of the answer, not the only element, but one element which I think is important. Then people, fanatic followers pay more attention to that fascist dimension or authoritarian dimension rather than to the other one, which is that the leader is a representative. And here, of course, populism has a tendency to replace representation with delegation, which is very authoritarian. So the leader is not only the one that you voted, but basically you gave the leader the ability to do whatever the leader wants. This form of delegation in a dictatorship becomes permanent delegation. And it is mediated through these kind of mythologies. So the more fanatic, to now say it in a simple sentence, the more fanatic the cult, the more fanatic the followers, the easier it is for the leader to convey that he's more important, he or she, or that they are more important than democracy itself or legality.
I would like to come in with a question here, actually, that you said there could be no fascism on the left. And there are two things there. There's a kind of normative notion of fascism. In other words, what do you call, well, the left can be extreme, as we know. I mean, if you know the Italian politics of the 60s and early 70s, I'm thinking about can't think of the name of the Italian terrorist groups, but there is certainly authoritarianism and the potential for extremism on the left. Globally, I would imagine, but that's kind of a normative thing because those people often are outside of power. They're extra parliamentarian, as we used to like to say when we looked at these things in the 70s. So you have that notion of a kind of fascism on the left. And then the second issue is a more institutional one, in the sense that one of the things that defined fascism in the 30s in Europe and even in Russia was the notion of a planned economy, basically. The notion that the state, that you were a worker for the state, and that basically the economy, you didn't have much choice in what you were going to do, and everything was sort of in order. And that kind of that sort of notion of the planned economy seemed to go both in the so-called leftist Russian state and the certainly that was a key part of Italian the Italian economic order and also German order. And it was also a key part of, if we sort of go up to Northern Europe, a lot of those planned economies, often thought of as socialist, were planned economies. So how do you, so both the normative and the sort of structural aspects here, do you have any comments on that? It's a thought, exercise here.
Yes, these are, of course, important decisions to be made. You can have extreme violence and extreme dictatorship on the left, such as Stalin, or I don't know, Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua, as we speak. But on the other hand, the question is related to, I think, to a big extent, to ideology. If we focus, for example, on notions of popular sovereignty, leftist movements, as violent as they might be, and they were, and they are, they will root the idea of the people in a political identity. So whoever is with the leader represents a kind of agreement with a political opinion. Then on fascism, what you have is something which is different, and of course populists left behind, which is that the nation is not only rooted in popular opinion, in the sense that the nation and the people are not only people that side with the leader, the majority, so to speak, quote unquote, this majoritarianism view, but also the nation in fascism is defined as an ethnic/religious group, something which often you don't find in the left. Mm-hmm. So you can have extremely violent outcomes on both, but theoretically, like, the notion of the people is different. Like that's one dimension. The other dimension is the very issue of violence, and I don't mean like about the quantity of violence, but the way that violence is conceived. So in terms of death, one can, of course, I don't think it is as useful to quantify. Let's say people dying of napalm in Vietnam, people dying in the Gulag, and so on and so on, or people dying, in the fascist war in Ethiopia. But the point is that in both communism or liberalism, you will find that the defense of that violence is presented as a means to an end, which is non-violent at the end. This is in the theory, right?
Yeah.
Whereas in fascism is the opposite. I mean, violence is not a means to an end. Violence is good in itself. So this idea of, aesthetics, but also ethics of violence. By ethics, I mean that they consider violence to be moral. Then I think you have a cleavage. You have a big difference between these ideologies. Because so this is that's.
I think that's an important point, the distinction between the means to the end and the sort of ontological just value of violence, actually. So, oh my goodness, you've gotten a couple more questions while we've been talking about this. So let me, they're a little different, but I want to do both of them because we have 7 minutes left and I'd like you to tackle them. So the first one is, can your framework be applied to somebody like Alvaro Uribe in Colombia, where the democratization of the other is based more on political ideology than on race or ethnicity? And the question goes on to talk about the way he picks future candidates for parties. And then the second question is, what should we do against the spread of fascist values in politics? To put it differently, how can society strengthen the values of the Enlightenment?
So regarding Álvaro Uribe, I talk about him in my book. And of course, he's been changing with the times, and he was a kind of very close to, to the politics of someone like Berlusconi or Carlos Menem in Argentina, Berlusconi in Italy. But of course, in Uribe, you add the violence and the addition of his paramilitary dimension. So perhaps Uribe can be presented as a kind of, linkage between previous forms of populism and more violent ones that are happening as we speak. So it's a kind of, I think it's a kind of, this is how I will see his populist trajectory. Now, I still think that, in his regime, it's not that democracy was entirely destroyed, but it was certainly attacked by his politics and the very fact that he was the populist leader in Colombia. So, it's a history that is also a moving target as we speak. But certainly you see in Uribe elements that eventually you will see in people in power like Trump or Bolsonaro. And yet you also see links with a kind of previous populist past. And the same perhaps we can say about another character such as Fujimori in Peru, where also violence was certainly violence and militarization was way more central than in other populist situations. So Uribe and Fujimori, in that regard, the elements of violence and militarization, they are connected to the present as well. Finally, and this is the last question.
The last question, well, so far the last question is about the Enlightenment and how can we restore Enlightenment values? And you can answer that in 6 minutes.
Okay, so this is great to be, to be the last question, is because it involves what can we do. We have been talking about how history help us or guide us even to understand the dangers in the present. But the question, of course, is also important to ask, to the extent that we can, to ask history, what can we do? Whether there are historical patterns that we can see for fighting fascists or authoritarians or wannabe fascists in effective ways. And here the answers perhaps are, I think in a way simple. The simple one is, of course, where we have to defend democracy. Democracies fail when people were apathic, where the separation of power and was not defended, when the judiciary and other elements of the state identified not with the constitution but the leader, when Congress or in some cases, for example, in Argentina in 1930, even the Supreme Court sided with the dictator. when the freedom of expression and the freedom of the press were not defended, when people didn't vote or didn't care, when the right to protest and actual protesting was not widespread. I mean, when all these things happened, fascists were not acting in a vacuum, but they were actually using what eventually was a political vacuum to do what they did. So when all these things happened, fascists succeeded. But when democracy was defended, fascism did not win.
Well, we're coming towards the end of our time here, and this has been a really remarkable conversation at a moment in time when as I said when I introduced you before, at least for the people who heard the beginning introduction, that in many ways it feels like in Europe we're back to 1938, at least at the moment. So and hopefully there'll be some, I don't know what to say about the Ukraine, but at any rate, I want to thank you so much for coming and sharing your work with us and your considerable scholarship on this issue. I want to thank our audience. I want to apologize for the technological glitch we had at the beginning. And I want to inform everyone that we have many events at IES this month, the month of March, on the situation in the Ukraine. So please keep in touch with we'll be sending out information about that. And sadly, the issue of populism, which it seems like, sorry, not populism as much, but fascism, which it stuns me to think that it's a current issue that we're dealing with today. I'm sure it probably has some effect like that on Professor Finchelstein. But at any rate, we are where we are. And again, thank you so much. And for those of you who want to engage with Professor Finchelstein, I'm sure you could send him emails directly. He's at the New School in the History Department, and I encourage you to read some of his really fascinating books. I won't say which one is my favorite or my favorites, but as you can see, there are many of them. So thank you again.
Thank you so much.